Homeland Security Secretary says the two officers who shot and killed Alex Preddy were immediately put on a paid administrative leave. That's according to an official with direct knowledge of the situation. The administrative leave was for 3 days with the option to take additional time off. The official said the agents have since met with a mental health professional, which is Border Patrol's standard operating procedure for any employee involved in a fatal incident, just like this one. Both officers will be placed on desk duty upon their return as the investigation continues per the policy, the official said. Still unclear if they've returned to work. This all contradicts, though, what former Border Patrol Chief Greg Bovino said on Sunday, telling reporters the officers involved were still working, but had been moved outside of Minneapolis. A lot of changing stories here between ICE and DHS and CBP and the private reports they're giving. It's a lot to keep up with. Meanwhile, Republican Senator Thom Tillis not backing down from his criticism of Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem, as well as White House Deputy Chief of Staff Stephen Miller, even after a personal attack yesterday from President Trump.
They're discrediting what I consider to be a very well-organized operation in ICE, but they're discrediting even these officers. They're going to make their job more difficult and more dangerous with this incompetence that I'm seeing out of Noem and out of Stephen Miller.
The president called you a loser, I believe.
I am thrilled about that. That makes me qualified to be Homeland Security Secretary and Senior Advisor to the President.
Shoo. Okay. And then meanwhile, the Republican chair of the Senate Homeland Security Committee has sent letters to the heads of ICE, Customs and Border Protection, and U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, calling on all three to testify before the committee for an open hearing on February 12th over immigration enforcement operations in Minneapolis and other communities. That's Senator Rand Paul who sent the letters, stating in part, quote, Congress has an obligation to conduct oversight on what he called the exceptional amount of funding that Congress has allocated to secure the borders and enforce immigration laws. Senator Paul spoke to Fox Business yesterday about the growing outcry following the killing of Alex Preddy as well. Watch.
When people watch that video and the government tells them, well, he was assaulting the police officers, nobody with any objectivity watches that video and believes that's what's happening. As the man retreats, with each altercation, he retreats, and then the woman is thrown violently to the ground. He's thrown to the ground. No American believes that he was assaulting the officers. In fact, the opposite appears to be true. So we have to get some rules of the game, and we can't have the government justifying this type of behavior because the vast majority of Americans think this was unfair, what happened. The intimation, or actually the explicit call to say you don't have a Second Amendment right to carry arms in a protest really flies in the face of most of our Second Amendment community. There needs to be an independent investigation, for goodness sakes. There has to be an investigation. If this happened on a police force, the officers, whether or not they committed anything wrong, would immediately be put on administrative leave, and there would be an investigation. But I don't know who trusts an investigation to be done by DHS when they're the ones calling this person an assassin, a would-be assassin, a domestic terrorist, saying he was assaulted the police. How can they be in charge of an independent investigation? Something's got to happen here.
This tracks with what Senator Paul said to me just yesterday on Capitol Hill when I asked about the changing stories from top DHS officials and then, of course, the report that CBP sent to committees like Paul's just yesterday. Watch what he told me.
For people to have confidence in government and confidence in the law enforcement wing of government, we have to be very honest. And I don't think it's honest to say he brandished a weapon. I don't think it's honest to say he assaulted officers. Every American's seen this video now, or most have. Everybody was snowed in for 3 days. A lot of people have seen this video. At every point in the video, he retreats. Now, I'm not saying he might not have been obnoxious. I'm not saying he might have said obnoxious things, but he films. He doesn't even obstruct the traffic. I think that at this point, because there hasn't been this honest approach to things, I think what you're going to have is an independent investigation.
And then there's this new video. You're probably hearing about it a lot from Republicans now because it appears to show 37-year-old nurse Alex Preddy, who was killed by federal agents in Minneapolis on Saturday, in a separate altercation with federal immigration agents 11 days before his death. We don't know what happened in the events leading up to the incident, but the footage shows Preddy wearing some of the same clothes as he was when he was killed, cursing at federal agents and spitting at one as they're getting into a car. When the agents begin to drive away, you see it, Preddy kicking and breaking one of the vehicle's taillights. The agents then get back out of the car. They wrestle Preddy to the ground for about 20 seconds. Ultimately, they let him go. The news movement outlet who shared the video say they worked with BBC Verify, which used facial recognition software to determine with 97% confidence that this is Preddy in the video. Two government officials confirmed to MS Now that the video is being reviewed by investigators, but haven't confirmed whether or not the person is Preddy. I want to bring in MS Now national security reporter David Rode. David, I want to start there because the president is, perhaps unsurprisingly, seizing on this new video, reposting it to Truth Social last night. There's still a lot we don't know about this incident. It was filmed 11 days before Preddy was killed. But I wonder if you can talk about how DHS might factor it into their investigation and also why it matters that 11 days before he was shot by Customs and Border Patrol agents that this happened. These are two separate incidents in my mind. What stands out to you here?
They are two separate incidents. He's possibly damaging government property by breaking that tail light on the car. He has a First Amendment right to scream what he wants at the officers. It may have been obnoxious, as Senator Paul said. And what's interesting, too, is that these officers at least wrestle him to the ground. I don't see a weapon on him, but they don't shoot him. And again, whether you're, breaking the taillight on a car or saying obnoxious things, you don't deserve to be shot. So we'll see what happens here. And I was just struck by Senator Paul and everything he told you and others yesterday in terms of members of Congress standing up in general.
I also just wonder what ends up happening if and when you do get key members of the immigration enforcement effort in front of members of Congress, especially because we have heard Republicans be skeptical of what's been happening on the ground. So I'm wondering, as we learn that these two officers who shot Preddy have been placed on leave, but also watching the ways that the administration's story has shifted multiple times, including in private reports to Congress, what a testimony like that may end up looking like and what DHS might be doing in the meantime, as there are conversations about de-escalating on the ground, but I'm not sure we've seen it quite yet.
Look, this is a messaging war. You know better than me. This is politics. But there's a pattern of DHS making false statements. This has happened since the administration came back into office. And bluntly, the president himself has done this throughout his political career. It depends. What's really interesting here is, Tom Tillis isn't running for re-election. He was much bolder than any Republican has been. And in a way, this is encouraging to me. This is democracy. This is the co-equal branch of government, Congress holding the executive branch accountable. And that's what should happen. And more of that appears to be happen because of the power, at least of that first video. And again, Alex, Preddy may have been obnoxious in that previous, incident, but he didn't deserve to be killed 11 days later.
Yeah, I think that's exactly the right point to make. And so this was a key topic of conversation on the Hill yesterday. But you and I spent the afternoon watching Secretary of State Marco Rubio testify, where he defended the administration's actions in Venezuela and spoke about what comes next. That's been the key question. In his first public testimony to Congress since the U.S. military captured and arrested Nicolas Maduro, Rubio insisted the mission was not an act of war, and said that at this time, Washington doesn't intend to take any further military action in Venezuela. But he didn't completely rule it out in the future. Lawmakers from both parties then criticized the lack of transparency about the raid.
If there was time to practice, there was time to consult. And consulting with Congress is not just some high-minded principle, not some abstract thing, not a nice to have. It's a got to have.
The truth of the matter is that this mission could not have been briefed to Congress because it wasn't even in the realm of possible until very late in December, when all of our efforts to negotiate with Maduro had failed, and the president was finally presented these options and made these decisions.
So you and I were texting about this a little bit yesterday, and I think what was the lens that I looked at it through as I was watching was the fact that this is a committee that Rubio served on the entire time that he was in the Senate. These are colleagues of his who know what his worldview is. And I was struck by the ways that he had to toggle between that background and also the fact that when any cabinet member from the Trump administration is in front of Congress, they are there performing for an audience of one. So what stood out to you about what we saw?
What Rubio said right there about not briefing Congress on this, he was a longtime member of the Senate Intelligence Committee, yes. And the top members of the committee were part of the Gang of Eight. They were briefed on the bin Laden raid. They did not leak it. That's a point that Senator Coons made last night. So this leak argument, again, it's the 8 most senior members of Congress are told when there's some major military action that's happened in past administrations. So it is, performing for the audience of one. And then the last thing is that I just saw Rubio sort of struggling to explain the president's broader foreign policy. I mean, at this point, we've got, an armada of ships threatening Iran, an armada of ships still in Venezuela that could carry out military action there that Rubio is saying isn't military action. You've got peace in Ukraine not yet achieved. Hamas has not been disarmed in Gaza. There were drone strikes in Nigeria and Somalia. And last of all, Greenland, which was, I think a real disaster for the administration with NATO allies last week. So the president is very active, but also arguably all over the place. And where is the coherent foreign policy here? And Rubio struggled to explain that yesterday.
Yeah, and I think there were 2 things. I mean, the fact that there was no tangible timeline for when they would pivot to small d Democratic elections. That's something that senators from both sides came out saying they were hoping to hear. And then at the same time, the way that he left military intervention on the table, when they were able to shift some Republican votes away from the War Powers Resolution a few weeks ago that would have limited what the administration could do without coming through Congress, part of the way that they were able to do that, you and I were talking at the time, was Rubio saying to key Republicans like Todd Young and Josh Hawley, we promise that if there's a military operation, which we don't think there will be, we will come through Congress. So leaving it on the table yesterday felt like an interesting move, but also one that appealed to Trump.
I agree. And look, the broader issue that Congress has brought up is how much is all this costing? There's estimates that the Venezuela operation cost $1 billion. And again, democracy, the oversight, the power of the purse, Congress wanting to know how much is all this costing? What is the strategy here? And it's their job, too, to ask, these actions put service members in danger.
Yes.
People were wounded in at least one in the helicopter that carried out this raid against Maduro. It's a miracle one of those helicopters wasn't shot down. A member of Congress told me it looked like Swiss cheese because so many rounds had hit it. The Cubans who were guarding Maduro really fought back. So we're lucky we didn't lose any soldiers in that raid. And these are the kind of questions I think members of Congress should be asking.
Yeah, Cuba among the number of topics that came up yesterday in a lengthy hearing. MS Now senior national security reporter David Rohde, thank you for coming on as always.